Again, my name is Warren, and I will be walking us through some of the sort of the general things about the specification designers. And also, as we play in the demonstration a little bit, we'll take a look at some of the things that you can do specifically in Adagio invoices. And hopefully, we'll be able to highlight some of those things for you today. The general layout we'll be doing for today's session is we'll just take a look at some of the setup options, some of the things that you can do for just getting the specification designer ready for creating forms or modifying. Typically, it's better to work with an existing sample form and just making a few changes rather than starting from a blank form. So we'll show you how to open one of the pre-existing templates and being able to start from there. We'll take a look at how to insert particular objects, simple things that you typically would add to a sample form perhaps, and including logos, sections, database fields, some text, and also being able to create vertical lines that go all the way through all of your detail sections. Once you've got some objects on your form, we'll show you how to manipulate them, how to align them so that they're all lined up properly, and to change all the size of a number of objects at the same time, just to be able to manipulate objects at the same time. We'll take a look at editing a particular object, being able to change some of the formatting settings, how dates are displayed or how numbers are displayed, and some of the things you can do for taking a field and displaying a different piece of code in a field that's already been formatted for you. And lastly, we'll take a look at a few application-specific features outside of Adagio invoices, just to highlight there's a couple of things you can do that are particular to those applications. And those will just be very brief slides, just so that we can show you a couple of other things outside of Adagio invoices. So that's the plan for today. Why don't we get right into the designer? And that's way more fun than just talking about it. I'll be demonstrating using the current version of Adagio invoices, version 9.0a. This was been shipping since about May, I guess, of this year. So let me just log into Adagio invoice sample data. And I will have one particular invoice that we'll test playing with as far as printing a form and getting an idea of what kind of things you can print and add. I'll just edit this invoice just briefly so you can see what kind of things that we'll be printing. On this one particular invoice, there's a number of different items that shows some hourly rates, subtotal section, some blank lines, some other sales-oriented type items, an item that comes from Adagio inventory, a surcharge, and an overall discount. So there's lots of different types of items that you could potentially use. And before we get into the designer, just to highlight that we'll be talking a little bit about detail sections and styles, and just identify that before you get into the specification designer in Adagio invoices, what you'll probably want to do first to enable the detail section printing is that in the edit area here, there's something called specification styles. And so essentially there's up to 26 different styles that you can create, which are basically like item templates. So if you print this type of item, what type of information you want to print? You might want to print a quantity and a description and a unit price and an extended price. And for a different type of item, maybe there's no associated quantity, so you don't need to print a zero quantity. You might just want to simply have a description and an extended price. And another type of item might be just strictly text only. There's no prices involved. Another type of item might do this. So there might be a number of different types of details that you put onto an invoice that you want to have different information print. And so what you first need to do is set up titles to separate the different types of things you would put on an invoice, and these are identified by letters here. Then when it comes time to setting up those items, then what you would do is you would associate that style code from this drop down here. So each item you specifically say, well, when this item prints, this is the type of information they'll end up printing. And the type of information you print will be on the specification designer, which we'll get to now. To open up specification designers in Adagio, you would go to the maintenance menu and maintain specifications. And it's a separate program that allows you to specify all the specification files that are saved in the same data directory as the rest of your data. Before we get into actually working on a spec, there are some options that you might want to set up as far as some defaults. So when you're adding new things, it's always adding it with the same font and the same size and so forth. And you can set that up here from the options menu and properties. And so from here, these are kind of the default settings. So every time you add a new object, what's the default size and so forth. On the System tab here, this is the place where you set your default font. So every time you add a new field, if you want it to be an Arial size 10 field, if that's the way that you have field objects generally on your specification, then this is where you can set this up. If you'd rather have Times New Roman, or if you've got another font that you typically use for your specifications, then you can set the font here so that when you add a new field, a text field or a database field, you don't have to edit every field and change the font every time. So this will make things go a little bit faster. You can also set the different default formats for dates, and for if you have true-false fields, like if an invoice is on hold or a customer's on hold or those sorts of things, those true-false type fields. Or if you print phone numbers, what kind of format, with or without the formatting, and so forth here. There's an option here called auto size, which you'll see on a number of different text fields. The purpose of this option on a field is if the object holder, which we'll show in a little bit, isn't quite big enough to display the entire field, auto size will mean just print it all anyway, so being able to display the field outside the boundaries of the object. And that's useful if you're printing things like customer names or things where you're not trying to fit it within a grid system. In the detail section, you might want to have a description fit in a very certain section, and you don't want to have it overlap. And so auto size is a field that's useful to have maybe in the header or something where you're not trying to specifically place fields within a certain box. In detail sections or footer sections, it tends not to be quite as useful. So typically, I recommend having this option disabled, except for situations where you know that, like customer names or address fields, there's nothing going to be printing to the right of it, so you won't have to worry about fields overlapping each other. You can set default formats for your dollars or for your non-currency numeric fields, and you can choose to either have the currency settings come from your regional settings, and we'll load all those settings from your regional settings, or you can set them any way you want. So if you don't want to print dollar signs with your numbers, if you want to have different settings for your numbers that you print, you can choose to set those here. And lastly, if you choose to insert vertical or horizontal lines, you can choose the default length of those lines, whether they're widths, which is representing of the horizontal lines, or the height, which is representing of a vertical line. Those are just simply default sizes. You can always change them after they're inserted, and how thick they are and what color they are. And similarly for shapes, which is essentially rectangles, what's the default size that you select, and whether you can see through the shape or not. So these are just basically all defaults. What we're going to do now is we're just going to create a brand new spec just by clicking New. And what you'll find when you create a brand new spec is it doesn't really insert anything. It's a completely blank form, and it's not really obvious what to do with it. You have to insert all the sections for you. And so this is why we recommend that you start with a sample spec if you're wanting to create a new invoice or a credit note spec, because from here it's kind of, well, what do we do? This is unless you're an advanced user, you're very comfortable with the specification designer. Being able to start from almost complete is way better than starting from a white screen, because it's not really obvious where you go from here. Let me just outlay a couple of things just as far as properties go before we show you how to modify a sample spec. You can find these underneath the File menu and Specification Options, and you'll almost always visit this place when you create a new spec. Some of the things that you can do when you set up your specification, first of all, you need to give every specification you create, whether it's for an invoice or a credit note, a unique title. And the reason this title needs to be unique is this title is what appears when you go to print invoices or you go to print credit notes. And so this is what appears on the selection. If you have two specifications that have the same title, it will look like it's duplicated, and you might pick the wrong one by mistake. So ensure that you have a unique spec title here, so that when you see it on the drop-down list, you can ensure that you're picking the right one. In order to make specification printing a little bit easier, you'll see that in more recent versions of Adagio Invoices and other Adagio specification designers, you can choose the type of specification if there's a potential of being able to print more than one. so that when you go to select an invoice specification, only those that are chosen with invoices will be shown, so you don't accidentally pick a credit note spec by mistake. Or similarly, if you go to print a credit note and you want to be able to select from the list of credit note specs, only those that are specified with credit note will be shown, or those that are specified with any. So if I wanted to create an invoice spec and not have it accidentally selected for when I'm printing credit notes, then I could choose an invoice specification here. You can choose also this custom paper size if you don't want to print a letter. There's a number of different specification sizes that are supported paper sizes. You can choose default, which means select the size that's set up for your default printer driver. Or you can specify a custom page size. Now you should be aware that if you choose custom, your printer needs to be able to support the size that you put in. So you can't just put in a random size here. Oh, I just want to be able to print a 7-inch by 3-inch invoice. If you want to be able to print this out, your printer has to be able to support that size. You can also specify the number of copies. So if you want to be able to print a customer copy and an office copy and another backup copy, you can choose up to 5 copies. And when it comes time to putting in information on your specification, not only will it print 3 copies, but you can also specify on most field objects that I want this to print on copy 1 but not on copy 2, or I want to print this on copy 2 and 3 but not 1, and things like that. So there's a number of things that you can do in setting up your spec in order for printing, and also making sure that you are selecting the correct specification when it comes time to printing. So rather than working on this blank form, let's create a new one. And instead of creating a new one from blank, what we can do instead is from the File menu, you can use an option here called Open Template. And a few selected sample specifications will be available here. In the case of Adagio invoices, we actually have a couple of dozen sample specifications, and rather than overwhelm you with all of them here, we have a selected few. If you want to investigate some of the other sample specifications, what you can do is you can just ensure that you have your sample data installed, and in the sample data directory, which would be in the SoftTrack Invoices SAM data directory, you can choose to copy one of those files and then save it into your live data directory, change the extension name to your own name, and then go from there. So let's just open up a sample template. I'm just going to choose this particular one here that includes payment terms. And already this one looks like it's a pretty a lot of things going on in the form. Let me just highlight a little bit about an overall structure for how invoice specifications work. Typically what you'll have is a page header at the top, and all of this information is reserved for the top of an invoice page. Down at the bottom, you'll have a page footer, or sometimes you might have 2 page footers. And so that will, of course, print on the bottom of the page. In the case where you have 2 page footers, like we have here in this sample spec, this page footer will print on all pages but the last one, and this section will print on the last page. And if it's only a single page invoice, then of course this last page footer will print. So that way, instead of having this large text print on the bottom of every page, you can have it print just on the very last page of a multi-page invoice. So the header prints at the top, the footer prints at the bottom, and whatever room happens to be left in the middle will be reserved for your details. So don't have your page footers and page headers too big, because otherwise you won't have a lot of room in the middle for your details. Similarly for the page footers, you can also choose to have multiple page headers. There's something called a second page header section, which allows you to print a different page header on the second and subsequent pages of a multi-page invoice. Within the page header and the page footer, there will be a number of detail sections which you can choose to put in your spec. And as we remember, we saw before with the specification styles, if you want to say that an item type A prints this information, then this is where you specify where detail lines of the type A and what types of information print for that, or what types of information print for the items associated with a B style, or a C style, or a D style, and so forth. And what you'll see here, the way that the details are organized, is that in this case there happens to be multiple detail sections for each style, and that's a preference in your case. You don't have to do it this way. The reason why these are set up this way is if I check the properties, that there's a section here called suppress blank. And essentially what you are able to do in Adagio Invoice is you can have a lot of text lines or a lot of different information. And if you don't want to print a bunch of blank lines, if you don't happen to be using the text for some items but not others, then you can choose to suppress those description lines if you want to minimize the amount of blank space on your form. So that's just the reason why you see multiple detail sections set up this way. So why don't we go ahead and insert some objects onto our form. And the first thing we can do is when it comes time to inserting objects, we might want to put on a grid so that we know about where it's going to be placed on a form. When you want to put on a form, what I can do is I can left-click on any section where I want to insert some new fields. And you'll see that there's some little red indicators that indicates that this section is active. Whenever there's something that's activated, such as this, you can right-click and have a pop-up menu do some things. And one of the options you can choose to do is to turn on a visual grid, and you can choose to set this grid as inches or centimeters. That's one of the properties within the options. And then that way, when it comes time to inserting new fields, you can choose to turn that on. And then if you want to turn that off, when you right-click again, you can see Visual Grid Off enables you to disable that grid. A simple thing that you typically would do when it comes time to customizing your grid is to put your company logo on it. And so taking one of the sample forms, here's a little label that just has the word logo. Probably want to delete that. I just click the delete key. And to insert objects in Adagio Invoices or any other specification designer, what you typically do is you just click on the toolbar button for the type of object that you want to do. We want to insert an image. And the specification designer, only bitmap images are supported. If you have a JPEG or some other GIF or some other object that you want to insert into your spec, you'll need to convert it to a bitmap before you can insert it in. When you click the toolbar button, what it does is it changes the icon to a plus. So you can see that instead of a pointer, it's now a plus. And wherever I click will be the top left-hand corner of where I want to insert the logo. Just one tip when it comes time to inserting logos. When I click where I want to insert it, it will pop up an information of sort of which bitmaps you want to insert. And I've got a pretty large one here. And if I insert this, you can see that the large logo is inserted. And certainly there's nothing preventing me from taking this logo and resizing it to the size that I want. The problem with doing this is that even though I've resized it and it looks like it's printing, and it will print just fine when you send this to the printer, but the actual file size of this logo is maintained. And this logo happens to be, I think, about 300 kilobytes. And so if you're going to be printing 20 invoices in the batch, it will multiply this logo, which is going to be a significant portion of your specification size, as part of the print job. So you multiply this times 20, you multiply that times 100, depending on how many invoices you print. And that has the potential of maximizing and perhaps overwhelming your printer job queue. So when it comes time to inserting logos onto your specification, whether it's Adagio Invoices or anything else, what it's best to do is to resize your logos as small as about the area where you want it to fit on your specification. So that way, when it comes time to printing a good number of specifications in a single print job, it won't. You'll be able to make the print job size as efficient as possible. That will make the print job print faster, and also has the less potential of overwhelming your printer. So if you use any program like Microsoft Paint or any other graphical program that you like to use, instead resize the logo a little bit smaller and have it fit about where you want it to fit in your object area. And so this object is probably about 40 kilobytes instead of 300, so you can see that the print size already will be decreased by 8 times. So that's just a tip as far as adding logos to your specification, is to resize them the appropriate size before you insert them. The next thing I like to do is add a new section. And if we take a look at our specification and scroll down a little bit, we can see that right now we don't have a detail line section F. Actually, these letters don't have to be alphabetically ordered, but that just makes it easier to maintain. Currently, there is no section F in the spec, but if we take a look at the invoice that we wanted to print, our discount field happens to have a style code of F. Actually, it's not visible here, but this actually has a style code of F. So if I tried to print this and use this specification, actually what I'm going to do first of all before I do that is save our specification here. So I'll just call it demo. Oops. Make sure I spell it right. And before I also use that, make sure that I go to the specification options and give it a unique title and save that. So when I select, oops, actually need to close this first and reopen it to reload the grid. There you go. There's our demo webinar spec that's now available. And preview it, you'll get an error message that the style code F, one of the items on your spec, doesn't exist. So because our specification is missing that section, it will be missing when you actually print it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a new detail section to ensure that that information prints. And you notice that I was able to preview specs when I actually had the file open. As long as you save the specification regularly, it's just a way as you're designing your spec just to make sure that it's printing the information that you want, and it's easier to test it rather than close the spec and close the program, try a test of the printing, oh, I'm missing something, go back, reopen the designer, open the spec, and so forth. So you're able to keep the specs designer open and the spec open as you print specs. Creating a new section. The easiest way to do that is by creating some space where you want to insert the new section, and just to make it easier to maintain, it's better to insert them between the two. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the section below where I want to insert my new section and just drag it down. Just drag it down a little bit. And I'll get a confirmation message saying, do I want to move all the objects below? So basically just want to shift everything down. And absolutely, yes, I want to do that. So now you can see the effect of doing that is creating some blank white space. Now to insert a new section, just like the logo, I'll just click on the Section toolbar button and click about where I want to insert it. Don't have to worry about the exact height. I can change that in a little bit. And here's where I specify the section type. And you can see the different section types that are available to me, the two different types of page headers, the two different types of page footers, a detail line, and there's a special one for end of page, which is basically something that you typically don't have to add on your own. It will already be on the sample. So the detail line I can add in, and then here's where I specify the type of the detail line I want to do, and I want to have this for my F style items. And if I don't have an F style item, and I can choose to suppress blank. And this particular specification I've got here uses 6 rows per inch. If I were to look at any of the other section heights, I would see that the section height would be 0.1666 inches, or 6 rows per inch. And so I can, at this time, change the section height so that it matches all of the others. When I say OK here, you can see now that detail line F has been added to the spec, and the row is ready to go. So what information do I want to add? Now I can choose to add fields. And how do you add fields in the specification designer? Well, it's a drag and drop kind of way. You don't have to type in special codes. It's as simple as loading up the field list and then identifying what types of information you want to load in. And they're subcategorized, hopefully to make it easier to find. Well, I want to add information based on detail, so I'd probably look at the item section. And what information do I want to print? Well, detail line F, we want to print discount information. And so basically, I think all we probably need is the text and the actual price that we're going to, or the actual discount amount. And the text can be found in the text line section. In our item setup, the information about the item is in the first text line, so we can just highlight the field and drag it and drop it where we want. I'm not going to worry so much about it being aligned, because we'll change that in just a moment to show you how to align them. And you can see that when a field is selected, it's got some red dots around them, and I can highlight my cursor over top of one of the red dots to resize it, either from the left or from the right, and also top and bottom, or I can use the quarters to resize both the height and the width at the same time. So the description simply says discount. If we take a look at the item, I'll just close these. The item itself just simply has a 2% discount, so it's not too long a text. The other information that we want to print is the amount of the discount. And if we take a look at the invoice to see what information is printing, the amount of the discount here is in the total before tax field. That's what we want to print. So what we'll need to do is find the total before tax field. And if we take a look at our item numbers, the total before tax isn't listed in this section. So we'll take a look at the next one. Actually, I'll just move this over a bit. And you can see total before tax is right there. So again, we can left-click to select it, drag it, and drop it where we want. You notice you can't drop fields on top of other fields. You have to drop it to white space first. And then from there, you can choose to move it around where you want, even if it's overlapping another field. So we've inserted the field there, and so there's an example of a couple of different fields, ways that you can drag information. All it's a matter of just finding it where you want it, and then dragging it to some blank space, and then moving it around or aligning it. If you just want to simply add text, you can choose to do so by adding something called a label. A label is not a database field. It's not grabbing something. It's just text that's always going to print. For example, you can see here's a label called labor subtotal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a label right here next to my discount percentage, and the actual text says 2% discount. So I'm just going to add some text in between. So not only do we know the 2% discount, but who's the one that granted the discount? Well, we can go take a look at the invoice header and the bill to, and the bill to salesman name, so we can see which salesperson gave the discount. Let's expand that a little bit. So this particular detail line, anytime that you add an item with the style code F, it will print a discount in a certain percentage. You might have different items at a 3% discount or a 5% discount or whatever. That text will print here, given by a salesperson name and the discount amount. You can also add text called memo. A memo is basically a multi-line text object. And the purpose of doing a memo would be if you have a number of text information that all print together. An address block is an example of one. And you don't want to have to worry about, if you want to be able to move a block of information around, that will always be the same for everything. Maybe your company information. Then you could choose a memo field to insert. And so you can see a memo field is a big block. And if I edit the properties by right-clicking and choosing properties, you can add in extra text. And this size of the block corresponds to the size of the object. So if I make this block really big and edit the properties, you can see that the block here is a lot larger. Or if I make this a lot smaller and edit the properties, you can see that the block here is a little bit smaller. And I'll just delete that because we don't really need it right now. One question that we often get about printing specifications, and specifically things like invoices or statements in AR or orders and order entry, is being able to print vertical lines. Up until about a year or a year and a half ago, it was very complicated in order to do that. You had to put in a line in the header section and make it really long, and then put individual lines in each detail section and have them overlap. And it was pretty complicated to add a vertical line. Nowadays, we hope it's a lot easier. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this one. And how is the best way to insert a vertical line so that it prints on our form? Let me just first preview so you can see that all of my vertical lines are printing all the way from the top to the bottom, and they stop at the page footer. And because this is a 2-copy form, you'll see that it prints 2 copies of it And you can see that the vertical lines stretch all the way from the top to the bottom. How do you do that in an easy way? Well, if you're using a relatively recent version of the specification designer program, probably in the last year, year and a half, all you need to do is to click the vertical line inserter and then click it somewhere about where you want it to be. The top of the line needs to be in the page header section. If you insert a vertical line where the top of the line is in the vertical section, what you can do is you can right-click and add an option to this line called Extend Through Detail. Any vertical line where the top of it is in the header section and this property Extend Through Detail will automatically print the line starting at the top where you insert it, and the bottom of the line will automatically extend to where the page footer section goes. So if I click that on, and I just use the cursor keys on your keyboard to move it around to where you want it, and I can move it down just so the top extends right around there. You notice how short it is, but when I preview, you can see that that vertical line extended all the way to the bottom of the details. Once you've done that, you may want to just simply resize the line so that it fits through all of your detail sections so it's easier to place. And so I can highlight the line by clicking on it, move my arrow on top of the little red dot, and then just simply drag it down to how short or tall you want it to be. It doesn't have to be to a specific height. I can choose to drag it all the way down to the very bottom here if I wanted to. Oops, let me just click on it. And let me just move down and click on it and drag it all the way down to my page footer if you wanted just to visually be able to see where the vertical line goes for when you're adding in information to all of your detail sections. It's a complete preference up to you. You can choose to do this or have the lines small and out of the way or short and out of the way if you wish. It's completely up to you. Even if it's long, that line will just simply print as long as it goes to the page footer section. So hopefully that will make adding and modifying vertical lines in your specifications a lot simpler to maintain. The next thing I'd like to do is to show you a quick way to be able to align objects together. As we saw that we inserted a text line here, and we probably want that left side of this text to be aligned with all of the other text. And so what you can do, there's two different ways of doing that. Essentially, it gets to the same place, but there's two different ways of selecting the fields. The first thing you can do is select by left-clicking on a field that's already in position, and we can use that as the anchor. Then, holding down the Shift key on your keyboard, left-click the field that you want to move. You can see that when you have two or more fields selected at the same time, that instead of red dots highlighting all the objects, now they are gray. Once both of those fields are selected, you can do 3 or 4 or 5 or select as many as you want. Right-click, and there will be an option on the right-click pop-up menu called Align Objects. And so I want these objects aligned all on the left side, and I want the first one that I selected to be the anchor, and all the other objects that I selected will move so that they align to the left of the first one I selected. So now that when I click left, you can see that it got moved over a little bit, and now it's left aligned with the object that I originally selected. Similarly, for my numeric amount, I probably want my numbers to right align. Select an object that's already selected. Hold down the Shift key, left click again, right click, align objects to the right. And so now you can see that they're right aligned. So instead of having to use the cursor keys and wondering if they're aligned and maybe they're a little bit off, you can choose to do so. Another way of being able to align objects in multiple ways, you can drag an area using a lasso. So if I click this area here and kind of drag a lasso, holding down the left mouse key, any field within this lasso gets selected. And so I've selected 3 different objects. What I can now do is I can right-click and say Align Objects to the top, And if they are not quite vertically aligned, aligning objects top will ensure that all of these fields are now vertically aligned on the same row. And probably I want to do the same thing with this numeric amount, so I'll hold down the Shift key again and select it, align objects top if they weren't already. So I'll just save that. So you can select fields multiple ways. You can choose to either just click the first one and then do shift clicks for all the other objects you want to select, or you can do a lasso in order to select multiple objects, whatever is easier for you. Note that if you select objects like this, if I want to get the numeric field, it will also select the line because the line was also part of the object, so just so you're aware of that. And that's why I chose to select these ones first and then do a shift click for this last one, so I ensure that I don't select the vertical line, because all objects within a lasso will be selected. You can also change the size of multiple objects at the same time. Let's go up to the top here. So let's say that I had inserted all of these address line fields, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to resize so that they're not quite all the same size. Oops. I'm able to do one level undo, so if I accidentally move something, I can do a Control-Z to do a single level undo to put it back. Let's say I want all of these address fields and the customer name to be all the same width. It's a simple matter of using a lasso or shift clicks to select all the fields that I want to be the same size. Right-click, and there's an option here called Size Objects. If I choose this option, you can choose to resize the width of all the fields or the height of all the fields, or both. And you can choose to either make them all the same width, the width of the smallest one, or you can make them all the same width, the width of the largest one. Or you can specify a particular width, especially if you want to be able to fit them all in a box, like if you've got a grid that you want to be able to print descriptions to, and you want to have all the descriptions for the different details to be the same width. You can choose whichever options makes most sense to you. So let's say that these three fields are all the largest ones, and they're the widths that we want to have all the other fields adjust to. So if I choose the option to grow to largest, all the widths of all the selected fields, and say OK, then you can see that all of the fields got expanded to the same width. Or if I wanted to shrink them all, what I can do is I can right-click and say Size Objects. And let's say instead of 3.4 inches, maybe I just wanted to shrink them all to 3 inches. OK, so now you can see that they shrunk a little bit. You could also move multiple objects at the same time as resizing them. If I wanted to move this entire block of the ship-to address, I can lasso them all and then either drag or use the cursor key to move an entire block of fields all at the same time. You don't have to move each field one at a time. So that's just another tip. If you've got a bunch of fields and you just need to shift the entire block over a little bit or up or down, then you can choose to do so that way. So I'll just save my progress so far. At this point, we've got a number of detail sections, a number of fields within each of the sections. Let's just take a look at some of the properties that you can set on each section. Again, to select a particular section, look at the properties. You just have to left-click on the gray bar where the blue text indicates the section name, and you'll see some little red dots on the left-hand side. And if I right-click, I can look at the properties of the particular section. And as we saw as we were adding a new detail section a little bit earlier, there's two different types of headers in Adagio INVOICES, one that prints on the first page and one that prints on every page except for the first. There's two different types of footers, one that prints on every page except for the last, and another different one that prints on just the last page. You also have detail lines, and you also have something called end of page, which its only purpose is to identify the section height of your last section. It doesn't force page breaks or anything like that. If you choose a detail section, as we saw, a letter will appear here, and you can specify the type of item style that will print in this particular section. Suppress blank allows you to specify whether the entire section, if all the fields happen to be blank text, will be suppressed. If you want to put a border all the way around the section, you can choose to do so if you wish, or put a background color if you're printing to a PDF or something that involves color. And you can specifically set the section height here. If you want to be able to make the section height bigger or smaller, you can choose to either change the section height here, or you can just drag the next section up or down. So if I want to make the page header bigger, and I just want to, I can just take the next section, click on it, and drag it down, and move all the sections below. And now all of a sudden, the section height has been increased. Or I can do the same thing by decreasing the height. So those are some properties of sections to be aware of. Each program, each specification designer will have different properties specific to the section. So there might be different types of details that you would use on an Adagio receivable statement as compared to here, or an Adagio order entry order, or Adagio time and billing bill. So there's special different options depending on the section, but the way to get to those properties is the same way for each designer. For fields, you can choose to change the way that they're displayed on a field-by-field basis. So if you want some dates to print one way and other dates to print a different way, you can choose to do that. Just left-click to select a field and choose the properties. The properties indicates information about the field. The properties isn't the place where you change the font or the color. There's a different option for doing that. What types of things can you change? Well, you can see that there's a date option field, and it will be a text option if you're editing a text field, or a number option if you're entering a number. And so there's a number of predefined date formats that you can choose. There's lots of different ones, and so you just pick the one that's most appropriate for you. Maybe you want to have a really long one that involves the day of the week as well too, so you can see the sample. Or you can have the date or the day come before the month and the year and so forth. So there's lots of different ones you can choose. You can have multiple copies, as we saw in the specification options. And if you want to have a particular piece of information print on a certain copy but not another, you can click the different checkboxes to say, well, I only want to print on this copy but not that one. This isn't the best example of a field to show this, but let's say that you wanted the invoice date to print on the customer copy but not your copy. What you can choose to do is unselect the checkbox, and this particular field object will only print on the first copy but not the second. Maybe let's pick a different field that might be more interesting. If we go down to the bottom of the form, we have labels, customer copy, and accounting copy. For a two-copy form, you probably only want the text customer copy to print on just the first copy. So if we right-click and look at the properties of this label, you can see that print on is set for just the first copy. And the accounting copy, if we look at the properties, is set just to be the second. Just a tip as we're investigating things in regarding multiple copies, you can choose from the View menu to look at the spec for all copies, or you can look at just a specific copy. So if you want to see what a customer will see, you can hide all of the fields that aren't set to print on the first copy by choosing first copy from the View menu, and you can see that accounting, which is not set to print on copy number 1, will be hidden. Or similarly, if I want to view the second copy, you can see the text for just copy 2 fields show up. If you drag and drop a field or a text or objects that you're allowed to specify printing on multiple specific copies, and you are viewing a certain copy, the copy location will automatically be set for you. So if I'm viewing copy 2 and then insert a label, then the print on should be set to just the second copy when I save it. Okay, so those are some things in regards to the fields that are available. When we entered in this numeric field, we noticed that it entered in a $sign and it wasn't bold. So why don't we change those to match everything else in the same column? So the first thing we need to do is to change the properties. And we want to get rid of the dollar sign, and so in order to do that, we have to disable the currency format from Windows Regional Settings, and then delete the symbol here. So now we've removed the symbol. To make it bold, instead of going to the properties, we go to the font, and from here we can set the field to be bold. So we'll save that. And why don't we go take a look at what we've been able to do with this specification now. So let's go back to the invoice, and we'll print it. And we've got our demo webinar spec, and preview it. And you notice that we didn't get the error message now. It was happy with what we did for detail section F. Let's just zoom in a little bit. And in Adagio Invoices, you can see the different types of information that prints for the items based on the different detail style codes and the different detail sections. So you can see that different text will print for these hourly type items as compared to the subtotal item. And if we take a look at this, we realize, oh, this particular item doesn't actually have an hour. So we can go back and change that subtotal text if we don't need that. Remember, this was just a sample, so maybe you don't care about having the rate per hour as part of the subtotal. So we can delete those fields out of the sample. It's a lot easier to take a sample and make modifications rather than start from scratch. Right-click in Properties, change that text there. Maybe we'll move this entire text all the way over. I'll just drag it, make a save, then we'll print this again. So now we can see our labor subtotal change based on the changes that we made and all the different things that are part of our specification. Customer copy, and then as we scroll down, page 2, the accounting copy. So we took one of our sample templates and just made a few different changes to them, and certainly the number of changes you would like to customize for your forms, how you would like to print them, depends on your preferences. So that's just a little bit about the Specification Designer in Adagio Invoices and highlighting a couple of the different features. The biggest feature in Adagio Invoices is the ability of setting different styles for each of your items. There's a number of other things you can do for setting up your specs. Just play with the Specification Designer. It doesn't make major modifications. If you just want to make a sample or make a copy of one of your existing forms and make changes just to see what that looks like differently, you can always do File Save As. Save that as a completely different form, change the spec options to call it like a play spec, and then make changes to your spec as required until such time that you're happy with your changes. So that's all we're planning on showing for the Invoices Designer. We just got a couple of other specification options that we'd like to show you before we close our session for today. First of all, if you are an Adagio Payables user and you're modifying your check specs, what you'll find sometimes is that you need to manually calculate the amount of details, the number of details that you print in your advice. And the reason is that advice checks and headers and footers can all be different sizes. There's no such thing as a page header and a page footer for checks. And so therefore, you have to tell the program how many advice details you want to be able to print. And so in order to be able to determine what that right number is, what you need to do is to first of all figure out how big your advice section is for your check. Maybe it's a pre-printed form. And on the specification, you'll have an advice header and advice detail. Figure out what those heights are and subtract that from your total advice section. Doing that will calculate the amount of section that you have left for your details on your pre-printed form. Whatever room is left, figure out what your section height is for your details and divide that, and that will determine the maximum number of details. So just to give an example, so let's say that you have the standard 3.5 inches for an advice, and your advice header is 0.75 inches, and your footer is 0.4 inches. You subtract that from your total advice height, and that means you've got 2.35 inches as room for your details. If you modified or looked at the section height for your advice details and you recognize that it's 0.1666 inches each, or 6 rows per inch, you divide them, and you'll find out that you have a maximum of 14 details. And so in order to set that on your specification, then all you need to do is go into your Edit Specification Options, and there will be a section specific to the checks and the place where you can type in and enter the max details for your check. So those details is on a check-by-check basis, of course, depending on your advice header and footer section heights, and also the size of your advice section for your form in general. So that's just one tip for doing a check creation and setup. One particular tip for Adagio receivables and printing statements. Oh, sorry, there's one more here for payables. When you print checks in Adagio payables, you have the ability of creating a special type of form so that if you regularly pay 20 invoices or 50 invoices and you have a number of void checks that are printing, and avoid wasting those pre-printed forms. They're a lot more expensive than just plain paper. What you can do is you can create a special type of form that will just simply print text in the detail section saying, refer to the attached form for the payment details. In order to do that, what you can do is you can set the advice detail section to 0 height, so you're not actually printing details. So whether you print a cash invoice that's got 20 distributions or whether you're using a check to pay 50 invoices, you will simply not print those details on the form. Then instead of where you print your details, just enhance and enlarge the size of your advice header and make it look like that you're printing details there. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. And basically just put in text that says the attached form. Then when it comes time to printing the form, you set the maximum details to 99 or some large number that represents the most number of invoices that you would pay or the most number of distributions you'd put on a cash invoice. The larger the number you put, the slower the performance. So you don't want to put that to 1,000 because that will make your check printing pretty slow. But just basically just make it the largest number that you can. That will be larger than the most number of invoices you would typically pay for your large customers, or sorry, your large vendors. We do have a sample check already set up for this, so you don't actually have to create this. Just take a look at a sample form called Sample Check with Attached Form, and that template will have this layout. And so this is kind of what it will look like. You can see that the header is a lot larger, and it not only contains the header portion, but it also contains the detail portion as well, what it looks like it will print on a form. You can see that the detail section is also 0 height. When it comes time to actually printing, this will only print one check for every vendor regardless of how many invoices are being paid or how many distributions are on the cash invoice. Of course, you may want to also additionally print that additional form. So essentially what you'll do is you'll create an advice-only spec or use a sample advice-only spec. And then when it comes time to printing additional forms, after you print checks, you always get that question, do you want to print additional forms? Well, then you can say yes to that and then redirect the advices to a plain paper tray rather than a pre-printed check form tray. We do have a sample one called additional form. And when it comes time to printing, oops, I didn't do that quite yet. When it comes time to printing the additional forms, you just print this advice-only form to a plain paper, and then you attach that plain paper to the check for your vendor. And you can put 50 or 100, maybe 50 or 60 invoices or distributions on a single piece of 8.5 by 11 plain paper and save a lot of your pre-printed forms from getting voided. So hopefully that's a money-saving and form-saving tip for you. One tip for Adagio receivables, and then one for order entry, and then we're done for today. A tip for Adagio receivables, you may, the types of detail sections that you use in your statement will determine how the information prints. There's two different types of sections for your details for printing statements. One's called with matching and one's without. The difference between the two is that with matching will automatically print the cash or the credits or the adjustments or anything that got applied to the invoice that's printing on the statement. However, if you choose that section, what will happen is that the original amounts will print as just the outstanding amount. It will partially paid invoices will not show the current balance, and the reason is that it will, because the cash and the credits and anything that's been applied to it is automatically printing underneath it. In order for the total balance for the customer to foot properly, the current balance field gets redirected to be the same as the outstanding balance. So the benefit of using matching details is that you can see specifically and the customer can see specifically which invoices were paid by which cash or credit notes or so forth. But the drawback is that the current amount field will always print the original amount. So here's just an example of a form that shows this. And every invoice is followed by the appropriate cash number. And you can see that the outstanding amount, which is the current balance, doesn't show for partial payments. It shows the same as the original amount, even though it was paid. So here's a case of a partial payment where this invoice was partially paid, but the outstanding amount is the same as the original amount. Or similarly, this particular invoice was fully paid by this credit note, or applied by this credit note, but the original amount still shows the same. There's a second type of detail section for your statements called without matching, and basically it just shows the invoices. It doesn't show the cash, it doesn't print the credit notes, it shows only the invoices. But what it will do then is it will foot the current balances exactly as what the current balances are. If an invoice has been fully paid or partially paid, it will indicate that for the field that prints the current amount. So here's an example of what this will look like. You can see that the invoices are not shown with the credit notes or the cash. They're not organized the same way. They're just simply organized by date or by document number if you choose that sort order. And the outstanding amounts are calculated. And so you can see here's a partially paid invoice, here's a fully paid invoice. The reason the cash and credit notes are printing, oops, didn't have that step in. The reason the cash and the credit notes are printing is there's a third detail section type called applied details only. And so you can choose if you wish to print the cash or the credit notes to print the applied documents only. And lastly, if you're an order entry user, we do have a specific field that's in the specification field list that allows you to print the word copy if you're reprinting an invoice or an order or a credit note. And if you're reprinting it a second time, it will automatically print the word copy in full capital letters in the field code. If it's the first time that you print the invoice or the order, it will not print the word copy. And that's just a way to easily specify for the customer if they said, can you resend me this invoice, that the word copy prints on it. Essentially all you need to do is to add the field code E62, and it's called copy label. And it will automatically look at the document, and every document and order entry stores a print count. How many times has this document been printed? And if it's been printed at least once, that print count is greater than 0, it will print the word copy. And so wherever you put that on your specification, make it nice and big and red if you want to, just choose that as you require. And so you can have the word copy print at the top of the form in whatever color or size you want if this document has been printed before. So that's all we have planned for you today.